Hi everybody. Off we go to chapter 6. And chapter 6, it's called Extensions of Demand, Supply, and Elasticity. I think if I were to rename it, I would probably call it something like how the price system works in mixed economies and using price elasticity of supply and demand to analyze the incidence of excise taxes. Anyways, that's what I would call it. Okay, so in this chapter, what do we look at? We look at the role of markets in open economies and what markets do is they set prices. Uh, Explain the role of intermediaries. These are so-called middlemen in markets, and they help reduce the transaction cost between the buyers and sellers. And the role of prices. Prices act as a signaling mechanism in the market economy to product producers and input owners, telling them who to sell to and how much output to produce. And then the next couple little sections here deal with government intervention in the market. Although we in Canada live in a capitalist economy, we do have some elements of a mixed economy, and we do have government intervention. And so we look at the difference between government policies surrounding so-called price ceilings and price floors. And then we also have some special government policies in certain agricultural sectors. We have so-called offer to purchase policies and marketing board policies. Okay, and we have, as much as we are a capitalist society, not everything is for sale in our economy. The government has mechanisms for restricting the sale of certain kinds of products. So we look at some of these. And then the final section in section 6 deals with using the concepts of price elasticity of supply and demand that we learned about in chapter 4, using that to analyze which party bears the incidence of a excise tax. So what excise taxes are, we'll get to in a bit here. Okay, so off we go to chapter 6, and the first little section deals with the role of markets in, oh my goodness, the role of markets in so-called capitalist economies. So the primary function of markets in capitalist societies is to set prices. And these prices provide signals to buyers and vendors. When prices increase, we know that a particular input or an output is getting scarce. When prices decrease, that indicates that there's a abundance or surplus of the input or the output. So price signals are the way that buyers and sellers in the market communicate with one another. And at the end of the day, the party with the most resources ends up buying either the input or the output, because it's the party with the resources with which to buy the input or the output. It's that party that has the best or the most profitable use of that product. And we know from studying supply and demand curves so far, we know that market forces of supply and demand set equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in our economy. But we also know that the supply and demand curves are sort of continually shifting around in the economy. And so the market prices continually sort of change. And it's these changes in prices that serve as a signal to input vendors to bring more or less inputs onto the market. And likewise, the prices in the output markets signal to product producers whether they should increase or decrease their output. Okay. Oh my goodness, I can't. Oh, I see how to do it. There's a trick. Okay, okay. So in most markets, not all markets, but in most markets, we have a vendor and we have a buyer, and in many markets we have a so-called intermediary. And intermediaries are really, they're middlemen. And middlemen, we have many names. I mean, they play slightly different roles, but we have many names for them. We have distributors, we have wholesalers, and we have retailers. So these are the middlemen, these intermediaries are the people that connect product producers with buyers. And the parties to a transaction, whether you're on the buyer side or the vendor side, the parties to a transaction incur costs when they undergo a market exchange. Vendors have to spend money looking for buyers, and buyers have to spend money looking for vendors of the goods they want. And so we all know that vendors spend money looking for buyers. They spend money on advertising, for example. And likewise, buyers also have costs when they look for products. I mean, either you go shopping door to door, from you're looking for a pair of shoes, you're looking for a special pair of shoes, so you travel from store to store. So you incur a time cost. So you incur a cost of your time, and you incur costs of transporting yourself from store to store. So if you're driving a vehicle, you're burning up gasoline during your shopping. So the intermediaries, these middlemen, one of their jobs is to reduce the transaction costs of the buyers and the vendors. So the intermediaries make it easier for both vendors and buyers to find one another. So as we know, many goods that we buy at a retail store. So vendor sells to the store, I go to the store and make my transaction there. I don't have to track down that strawberry grower down in California to buy strawberries. I just go down the street and go to my local Sobeys store. So the Sobeys store is the middleman that helps reduce the transaction costs, the search costs of the buyers and the vendors in that food transaction. Okay, so we mentioned before that our markets in the free economies, the forces of supply and demand establish prices, and the prices get interpreted by vendors and buyers as signals for what they should do. So prices help to ration the supply of finished products in the product market. So only people with the most resources can afford to buy those finished products. And likewise, prices also ration the supply of inputs in the input markets to the resource buyers that are also able to afford them. So it's the prices that send these signals in the input and the input and the output markets to the respective buyers and to the respective sellers, telling them whether to increase their supply or to decrease their supply. So the price system in our economy is sort of the most efficient way of allocating resources in our economy, because the parties that buy those products or the inputs are the parties that make best use of the inputs or outputs, and no other, in theory, no other party can be made better off using those products or inputs than the party that pays the most for them. Okay, so we do know that in economies, even in our economy, we have some other mechanisms for rationing finished products to consumers besides the price system. We have some non-price mechanisms. So one non-price mechanism that we're all acquainted with is so-called queuing. Queuing. Oh my goodness, my little freaking mouse. Jeez, why are my computers? Oh, there it is. Sorry. It's queuing. I don't know where the word came from. I don't even know how to spell it, but queuing, otherwise known as lineups. So we see this all the time, you know. There's a popular musician is going to have a concert in Edmonton. The ticket agent puts the tickets on sale. The prices for the seats are all established, and in order to buy a ticket, you cannot just bid on them through an auction. You have to get in line, whether the lineup is on the street or it's on an online auction or on the phone or something. But lineups is sort of one way of allocating scarce resources in our economy. So it's first come, first serve principle. And then sometimes resources are allocated through lotteries. You know, you've got a product that has a large number of people wanting to acquire it, and the vendor decides that people will win the product through some kind of a lottery system. So sometimes we see this in, you know, radio stations. They have tickets to concerts or something like that. And they don't sell those tickets. They hold some kind of a contest or some kind of a lottery and allow people to win. Okay, another mechanism. We don't see it in Canada nowadays, but we have seen it in Canada in the past, is the use of coupons. So, for example, during the Second World War in Canada and in a number of other countries, because there was a war effort going on and the government wanted to devote the economy's resources to the production of military goods, they rationed the supply of certain products. So that sometimes they rationed some food products like sugar, sugar and butter, because they wanted to send those foods to soldiers overseas. And then they also rationed gasoline. And there was a number of other products that were rationed in Canada during the Second World War. And then another, waiting. I would say waiting is the same as queuing. I was going to say the other way. I didn't know that was repeat. Is another form of non-price system we use to ration goods is to get into certain schools, in certain post-secondary schools. Sometimes they ration the seats by your high school marks. So it's not really a lottery, it's not really a coupon, it's not first come first serve, it's not price. It's another non-price mechanism. But again, it's rationing these scarce seats in a school through a non-price mechanism. Okay, so in mixed economies, you know, for the most part, you know, Canada is a mixed economy, and for the most part, our prices are set by the price system, the supply and demand. But in mixed economies, the government also gets involved in intervening in markets and sort of regulating prices. So a couple of these government mechanisms for regulating prices that we're going to look at are so-called price ceilings and so-called price floors. And I think the concepts of these are intuitive just by looking at the names. Price ceiling is it's a maximum price that vendors are allowed to charge. Maximum price, it's kind of like a ceiling in a house or a room, and floor price is a minimum price that buyers are allowed to pay for the product. So I think these concepts are intuitive. However, there is a slight counterintuitive aspect to them that I'll try to remember to point out to you. The counterintuitive point is how we diagram these things with supply and demand diagrams. The diagrams are counterintuitive because although the price ceiling is a maximum price, the maximum price, the price is less than the equilibrium price. And that means when we draw the diagram, the ceiling is, here's price equilibrium, and here's the ceiling price. It's underneath it. And likewise in the floor price, here's the price equilibrium price. The minimum price is actually above. The price is greater than equilibrium price. So, but it's a floor, but it's higher than the equilibrium price. Anyways, it's a little bit of a counterintuitive angle to this thing, but what the heck. Okay, so price ceilings. I've got a diagram here. We do. Okay, so price ceilings prevent the market price from reaching the free market level. So we've got a demand, we got a supply, demand, supply. Here's our equilibrium price, and the ceiling, price ceiling, is down here. And so the price ceiling creates a shortage. So the government says the price can only be this level here. This is the free market price here. The government says no, the ceiling has to be lower. This is the maximum price vendors can charge. And so we have a quantity demanded of this amount, quantity demanded, but the quantity supplied is only this amount. And we know that that difference is called a shortage. So sometimes we see these price ceilings. They're not very common, but sometimes we do see these price ceilings in in the apartment rental market or the accommodation rental market. The government says, hey, rents are too high, therefore we'll reduce the price so more people can have affordable housing. Anyways, the consequence is shortages in the rental market. Okay, so this is exactly what we just diagrammed on the last slide. Here's our demand curve, here's our supply curve, here's our equilibrium price. So the example here is the rental accommodation market. So here's the free market price. The government says, no, you landlords don't know what to charge. You tenants don't know what you should be paying. So the government sets a price of only $650 a month rather than $800 a month. So it's $650 a month. Here's the number of apartments that people want to rent per month. In Edmonton, they want to rent 70,000 apartments per month, but landlords are only willing to supply 50,000 at that price, and so the difference between those two is a shortage of 20,000. So in Canada, there are only 3 provincial jurisdictions with residential rent controls. There's Ontario, BC, and Manitoba. So it's not so common across Canada. Okay, so price ceilings are okay. So price ceilings are a non-price rationing device, and what price ceilings when there's a price ceiling and when there's a shortage in the market, the market tries to address ways, come up with ways to address that shortage. So one mechanism is first come, first serve. So if a landlord's got a vacancy, whoever contacts the landlord first wins. Second way the market tries to address the shortage in the market when there's a price ceiling is landlords using higher tenant standards. So landlords can be a little bit pickier about the quality of tenant that they accept. And then the third way is the development of so-called black markets. And this has different names in different places, but sometimes you hear about key money. You'll hear about this in Ontario. So the landlord is restricted to charging $650 a month. But the tenant is willing to pay more, but the government says, no, you can't spend your money the way you want. You can't spend an extra $150 a month. So maybe the landlord says, oh, okay, tell you what, Mr. Tenant, if you really want this place, I'll charge you $1,500 for the key. Yeah, you can still pay $650 a month for rent, but if you want the key to get in the door, well, you got to pay for that extra. And of course, that key money effectively tries to make up for the difference between the free market price and the black market price. Anyways, key money is not legal, but I don't think anyone really gets caught. Okay, so when we have a free market setting the price, and we have the equilibrium price set by the market, what does that? What's the consequence of that? So one thing is when the market sets the price as opposed to government policy, it encourages landlords to maintain their properties and to construct new properties. Because if landlords are making enough money, then they can afford to maintain the place. But if the price ceiling keeps the rental price too low, then landlords will say, hey, I don't have enough money to maintain the place. Therefore, I'm going to reduce the amount of maintenance that I do. So the free market price encourages maintenance work. The free market price encourages potential landlords and existing landlords to construct new rental accommodation. And then it also rations the availability of rental accommodation to the parties willing to pay the most. It allocates the supply to the highest value users. I mean, that's the market principle. And so what are some adverse consequences of price ceilings, PC, in the rental accommodation market? Well, first of all, it creates shortages because it discourages construction of new housing, and landlords or people don't want to get into the rental accommodation market because they can't make enough money. It discourages landlords from doing sufficient repairs and maintenance on the place because they're going to claim that they don't have enough money, and so they don't reinvest enough in repairs and maintenance. And it reduces social mobility because people aren't able to move around in society as much as they might otherwise want because there's a housing shortage. How can I move to Calgary if there's no apartments for rent in Calgary? Anyways, well, I should say Toronto, not Calgary, because there's no rental control in Calgary, but there is in Toronto. Okay. So what are some other consequences of price ceilings in the accommodation and rental market? So people try to evade the rent controls. So landlords might kick out tenants out of the apartments and then convert apartments into condos. And then they just sell the condos. So they get out of the industry. But so they kick people out of apartments, turn them into condos, sell them off, get out of the market. Okay. So another consequence of rent controls, or another way of people try to evade rent control, is tenants sublet the apartments to someone else. And the landlord doesn't charge the higher rent, the tenant does. And then the tenant moves out of that apartment and it takes the higher money received from the subletting tenant to go rent a better place someplace else. So it's kind of an indirect way of getting around this price controls. And then another consequence of price ceilings in the rental accommodation market is the development of housing courts. So of course you don't see this in Alberta because there's no rent control here. But in Ontario, they do have some specialized housing courts to deal with disputes between landlords and tenants. Okay, so when you look at the rental accommodation market, because it's affected by price ceilings in certain markets, certainly across Canada, who are the winners and who are the losers when price ceilings are in effect, or I guess government policy of rent control in effect? So who are the losers? Well, the property owners, they claim they can't make as much money from tenants as the free market would otherwise allow them to do. So they lose. Low-income people lose because there's not enough supply of housing in the market, and social mobility is impaired. And it's probably the low-income people that are more adversely affected by the housing shortage than the more affluent. And landlords have no incentive to rent to low-income people because the landlords are trying to get more money from the more affluent people. So who are the winners from rent control? Well, more affluent people can afford key money. More affluent people can probably afford to sublet apartments and kind of play the rental accommodation industry a little bit better than less affluent people. So we do have some winners, but we also have some losers. Okay, then this last little section here deals with price floors. So this is another form of government policy. And the most, so price floors, here's our supply curve, here's our demand curve. So here's our free market price, PE, here's our free market quantity, QE. And a price floor is when the government says buyers have to pay a minimum price for a certain product. And so the floor price, here's the floor price here. So this is the counterintuitive aspect. So we understand that a floor price is a price below which a price cannot fall. But the counterintuitive part is when we draw these things on a supply and demand diagram, the floor price is above. The floor price floor, is greater than equilibrium price. And so when the price is $7, the market supplies this quantity, but the market only demands this quantity, and the difference between the two we know is a surplus. So price floors lead to surpluses, and they prevent the price from falling to the true equilibrium price. So price floors, we are acquainted with them in Canada through minimum wage laws. All the provinces in Canada have minimum wage laws. So the free market price for unskilled workers is $6 an hour, let's say. And the government says the minimum wage has to be $7. I think it's actually more like 10, but anyways, the government says it has to be 7. So at $7 an hour, lots of people want to find work. That's the supply of workers. But businesses only want to demand this quantity here. They only want to demand this quantity here. The demand for labor is businesses, or employers, I should say. So at price of $7, we have this supply. We have this supply, this quantity supplied, this quantity demanded, so we have a surplus of 800 people, and we have unemployment. And I have to admit, this is a fairly controversial aspect of economics, and we do see it debated all the time. A number of governments across Canada now want to increase the minimum wage. I think it's happening in the province of Alberta. And there's some dispute as to whether or not, I mean, the price floors are part of economic theory, but there's some dispute as to whether or not it actually holds true in reality. But anyways, it's accepted theory, but like everything else, people have differences of opinion. Okay, so we mentioned earlier that the government has some additional policies that they can use for intervening in markets. So instead of letting the market forces of supply and demand set prices, sometimes the government has some other policies for helping certain people. Oops, and sometimes you see some of these extra policies in the agricultural sector. So we have two types of two additional forms of government intervention in agriculture markets. We have a so-called offer to purchase policy, and we also have a marketing board mechanism. I can't think of any examples of an offer to purchase policy in Canada at the moment. I kind of suspect there aren't any, but we certainly see lots of examples of marketing boards in the agricultural sector across Canada, including Alberta. There's lots in Alberta. So why would the government come up with these mechanisms for intervening in agricultural markets? And the basic rationale is to stabilize farm income. And there are two reasons why governments feel the need to stabilize farmer income, and it's because farmer income tends to be highly variable in both the short run and the long run. So farmer income can be highly variable in the short run due to uncontrollable factors. So we all know that there can be so-called weather events, snow in the middle of summertime, tornadoes, hurricanes, and whatnot that can destroy crops, and so those forces of nature can have an adverse impact on farmer incomes. And then likewise, the price elasticity of demand for agricultural products is relatively inelastic. And what this means is if there are supply shocks in the market, then the price can change quite considerably, and that means farmer incomes will also change quite considerably. So here's our demand curve for agricultural products. Here's our demand curve. It's relatively inelastic, so I'm trying to draw it fairly steeply. And so, so let's say we have here's our original supply curve here. So here's our original price Q1. Here's original quantity Q1. Now let's say there's a bumper crop for a particular commodity something. Let's say it's apples. There's a bumper crop in apples. There's a bumper crop in corn or something. So the supply curve shifts out. We kind of think that's a positive thing. Supply curve shifts out. Consumers benefit. We get lower prices. Quantity increases. So that sounds positive from the consumer point of view, but the drawback from the vendor point of view is large change in price, small change in quantity results in lower revenues. And so the government has kind of stepped into the agriculture markets to kind of prevent these free market forces from prevailing in order to help protect farmer incomes. Some economists, or not just some economists, but some people in society think that food production is kind of a special commodity and it deserves special production or special protection from the government, but not everybody else in society agrees with that, but some people do. Okay, so how do these offer to purchase policy work? So effectively it's a combination of a floor policy coupled with, so we know that with a floor policy, here's our supply and demand, here's our demand curve, here's our supply curve, here's our free market price, here's our floor price, there's the quantity that farmers will produce, here's the quantity that buyers want to buy at that price, and we know that that's going to create a surplus. So this is surplus. So what happens is the government sets this floor price, the market overproduces, and then the government goes out and buys that surplus from the farmers. And so at the end of the day, consumers end up paying more money for the product. Price goes up, and then the taxpayers effectively subsidize farmers through the government purchase of the surplus. So the consumers get hit twice, once in the higher prices for the product itself, and then secondly with higher taxes to help pay for the purchase of the surplus by the government. So this just demonstrates exactly what we just looked at. Here's our demand curve, here's the supply curve, here's our equilibrium price, here's our floor price. Floor prices create surpluses. At this price, the market suppliers produce this quantity here, but consumers only want to buy this quantity here. So consumers end up spending more money than they might otherwise, and they end up actually consuming less than they would otherwise, because in the free market, price of $500 a ton, they would buy 15,000 tons of apples or whatever it is. But with this floor price, they actually end up consuming less and buying more, consuming less and spending more than they would in the presence of free markets. And sometimes we can imagine that the government buys this surplus and then maybe they donate it to poor countries overseas as part of a foreign aid kind of program. Okay, so effectively, I think I have to go to the next slide to, oops. Okay, sorry, okay. So next form of government intervention that we see in agricultural markets are marketing boards. So really what happens here is the government sets quotas on how much producers can produce. So instead of producing at the free the equilibrium quantity that the free market would set, the government says, no, you can't produce that much. So here's a demand curve, here's the supply curve, here's our equilibrium price, and here's our equilibrium quantity. And the government says, oh, geez, we can't have you guys producing this quantity. We can't have you producing at the equilibrium quantity. We're going to set up these quotas, and each farmer is only going to be able to produce a certain quantity of milk, a certain quantity of eggs, a certain quantity of chickens. There's a lot of these consumer kind of products that we have marketing boards for in Canada, especially in Alberta. Well, not just especially in Alberta, but in Alberta as well. So the government says, hey, you can only produce this quantity here. So this is the quantity that the market produces, and this is the quantity that farmers get paid, and people end up consuming. Same with offer to purchase programs. The consumers pay a higher price than they would in a free market, and they consume a lower quantity than they would in a free market. But I guess the nice thing about a marketing board is that there's no surplus. There's no surplus. So at least consumers don't get double whammied by paying a higher product price and paying more in taxes to buy the surplus. So I guess if there's a virtue behind marketing boards, I suppose that's it. So what I want to kind of point out here is that what this means is that, so here's the original supply curve in the free market. But when you have a marketing board, this effectively becomes the new supply curve. That's the new supply curve with the marketing board. Okay, so oops, didn't mean to go there. So what happens when we have, oh, maybe I did. So what happens when you have marketing boards? The market producers underproduce underproduce. I mean, they would produce this quantity. They would produce 15,000 tons in a free market, but now they only produce 14,000 tons. So the industry underproduces, and the farmer income increases, and we can easily calculate this. So remember before in chapter 4 we said the area under the demand curve from the intersection of price times quantity touching the curve, the demand curve, is total revenue. Total revenue equals P times Q. So in the free market, we have a price, total revenues equals price of 500 times, that's P, times quantity of 15. I think that's 7.5 million. I was going to do it in thousands. And with the marketing boards, total revenue is a price of 700 and a quantity of 14, and that equals revenue, a producer revenue of 9,800, or it's 9.8 million, but anyways, 9,800. So with this marketing board, we see that farmer incomes has increased. Price paid by consumers has decreased over the free market price. Quantity consumed by consumers decreases from the free market quantity. Farmer incomes increases. So we have winners and losers, even when you have marketing boards. So losers are consumers who pay more for the product. Consumers also lose due to consuming less than they would in the free market. So consumers are losers. New producers are losers. So if you wanted to get into this industry, and the government says, well, this quota is in place, so that means if you want to join the industry, you're going to have to buy the quota off someone else. And so your costs to enter the industry as a new producer are going to be higher than the original participants in the industry, because the original participants in the industry receive the quotas for free. Anyways, so that's the way it works. The original guys in the industry, they get the quota for free, and then they sell it for more money down the road. Okay, and then another loser are foreign producers. So we'll come to this later in the course, but maybe we'll come to it in macroeconomics. But we tend to think that free trade between countries is a positive thing. It's positive for domestic consumers because they can buy less expensive goods than those are produced domestically. And then, of course, foreign producers also benefit because they get to expand their markets. And, of course, it works in return for Canadian exporters as well. So if a market has marketing boards that prevent foreign producers from selling in the domestic market, then the foreign producers are also losers. And this is a big controversial issue in Canada right now. Canada does have a lot of marketing boards in agricultural sectors of the economy. And the foreign countries don't like Canada for that, and Canada wants to participate in the European or in the Pacific Free Trade Agreement with Asian countries in the United States, and many countries at the moment are giving Canada a hard time about its agricultural support policies. Anyways, we'll see what happens there. Okay, so the government can also intervene in the market with other mechanisms to restrict the access to products. So they can do certain things. They can impose effectively impose quotas on producers. Sorry, they can impose quotas on the number of parties, the number of producers in the industry, by requiring those producers to have licenses. And so this is quite common in the banking sector in Canada. Not anybody can start a bank. If you want to start a bank in Canada, you have to get a charter from the federal government, and they don't just hand them out to anybody. Okay, then sometimes the government actually bans products for sale. So there's all sorts of stuff that are banned for sale in Canada. Certainly, illegal firearms, illegal recreational drugs, for example, they're banned. I think the book mentions that there's a ban on human organs. There's a ban on the sale of human organs in Canada. So if you have a bad kidney and you wanted to get a new kidney in Canada, you cannot buy a kidney from somebody. Other parts of the world are different, but anyways, I have a slide here about this. Oh my goodness, there it is. Oh yeah, here it is, sorry. Way down at the bottom, way down, all the way down. In Canada, you can donate kidneys, but you cannot buy them. Oh my goodness. So, can a person, so if you can't buy one, you can't sell one either. So in Canada, can somebody sell their organs for money in Canada? And the answer is no. If you have a friend or relative or even a stranger who needs a kidney or any other organ, you can donate one, you can give it away, but you can't charge for it. And then another interesting product, I'll call it, in Canada that's banned. It's not necessarily banned in all countries, but it is in Canada, is so-called surrogacy. So I shouldn't say this. Surrogacy itself in Canada is not banned. So surrogacy is where, a family wants to have another baby, but the wife isn't physically capable of having one, or she is, and she just doesn't want to use her body for that purpose. So you effectively find someone else to have your baby for you, and then of course they give it to you at the end. So surrogacy in Canada is legal, but you cannot do it for pay. So you can do it for free as a donation, like donating one of your organs, but you cannot hire somebody as a surrogate mother in Canada. I believe there is legal surrogacy in some other countries. So sometimes you hear about Canadians kind of going across the border kind of thing. Anyway, so you cannot hire somebody to bear your children or bear a child for you, just because it doesn't have to be yours, in Canada. However, even if you have a donor, you are legally capable of reimbursing the surrogate mother for her quote-unquote reasonable expenses, but you can't pay somebody. So there's obviously a legal difference between reimbursement and paying. Okay. So another product that it's not banned in Canada at the moment, but sometimes we hear about it. I came from British Columbia, and we constantly hear in BC about this demand for a ban on so-called raw log export. So BC has a forestry sector, chop down trees, you saw it up into lumber, and at the moment, companies don't have to turn the logs into lumber in BC. They can sell the logs to a sawmill in the United States, or they can sell logs to sawmills in China or Japan, and they ship them across the ocean and get milled overseas. But we can all kind of figure this out. If we actually process the logs at home, we could probably create more jobs in the domestic country. So there's been a demand for raw log exports, a ban on raw log exports from Canada and BC for quite a few years, but I have to admit I don't think the government's able to do it under the free trade agreement with the Americans. But anyways, it's something that sometimes we hear about potential bans in. And then another area of the economy where we hear about bans all the time is in the labor market. We have, Canada's founded on immigration, and the government sets a kind of a quota on how many new immigrants can come into the country every year. And but effectively, this is a quota. I mean, presumably there's more people who would prefer to move to Canada than the government allows. So effectively, the government restricts the importation of foreigners through this immigration levels. Immigration levels. So it's effectively an import quota on migration. Although occasionally you'll have it in product markets as well. But okay, so the final little section from this chapter is, deals with excise taxes. And when an excise tax is applied to a product, which party, the buyer or the vendor, pays most of the tax? So when you speak about a so-called excise tax, it's different than, it's not an income tax, it's not a sales tax, it's simply a tax imposed on a particular product. And so we all know that when you buy alcohol, 80% of the price of alcohol is a tax. It's not a sales tax, it's an excise tax, it's an alcohol tax. Likewise, cigarettes, I don't know what the percentage of the price of cigarettes its tax is, but there's excise taxes on tobacco as well. Fuel for your vehicle, gasoline, is also an excise tax there. And one that people are also sometimes familiar with are hotel rooms. So often municipalities will impose a tax on hotel rooms, so they're kind of taxing tourists visiting the town for the value of the town services that they use. So there's often a tax on hotel rooms levied by municipalities, and that is effectively an excise tax. It just applies to hotel rooms or motel rooms, that kind of thing. Okay, so if we have a product and the government imposes a tax on it, it's gasoline, it's 50 cents a liter. Who pays most of the tax? Is it the seller or is it the buyer? So how the tax is allocated is called the tax incidence. It's the allocation of tax between the two. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our supply and demand diagrams, and we're going to use the price elasticity of supply and demand to tell us which party bears the greatest incidence of an excise tax. And I know that some of the stuff it seems a little bit convoluted, but there's a bit of a trick on how to do these things, and there's a way to kind of understand this to get it correct every time. So I'm going to try to show that to you. Okay, so the first little thing we're going to look at here is just how an excise tax works. So here's our demand curve for, oh my goodness. Here's our demand curve for cigarettes, so many millions of tons of tobacco per month. And here's our original supply curve. And here's our price per carton, okay. $50 a carton. That's our equilibrium price. And then the government comes along and says, hey, we want to impose a $15 per carton excise tax on cigarettes. So we saw this in chapter 3, I believe it was, when we have a supply curve, and if costs increase, so labor costs go up, or raw material costs go up, or whatnot, the supply curve shifts to the left. Well, an excise tax increases the cost to sellers. So tobacco vendors have to pay this higher price, they have to pay it to the government. So the supply curve shifts left. So now we have a new supply curve here. So in this, okay, so what we have here, here's our original equilibrium price, and here's our original equilibrium quantity, 5. And now we have this excise tax of $15 per carton imposed, and the excise tax, that's the difference. That's the $15 is simply added to the supply curve vertically. So that $15 excise tax is represented here. The original price is $50 per carton. Add $15. Here's our new equivalent price with the tax. But again, the market forces establish the market price. So the market price is established by the intersection of the supply and demand curve. So here's our price number 2, and here's our quantity number 2. And so we can see here that with the imposition of this $15 per carton excise tax, the price goes up to consumers, the price goes up, and the quantity declines. Okay, so we need to figure out which party bears the greatest incidence of the tax. Of that $15, it's not that the consumer pays the whole $15. The vendor pays part of the $15 and the consumer pays part of the $15, and we want to figure out how much each party pays. So we have to understand the simple rule. There's a simple rule, and once we understand the rule, then we can kind of figure out which party pays the greatest part of the tax by using the elasticity of supply and demand. So the rule is, I should create a slide here, just a sec here. Insert. No, it's all right. New slide. Okay. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. I keep forgetting I'm not in Collaborate. I can't. Sorry, I can't write. I can't type. I was going to type so you didn't have to read my handwriting, but I can't type. Okay, so you're gonna have to read my bad handwriting. So what's the rule? So the rule is, here's our question, which party bears the incidence of the tax? So it bears the allocation of the tax, the allocation of the tax. So the rule is part A. The incidence paid by the buyer equals oh my goodness, that's right. The amount of the tax no, that's not right. Equals the difference between new price equilibrium price and original equilibrium price. So in our little diagram here, $50 was our original equilibrium price, and our new equilibrium price is $62. So here's equilibrium price 1, here's equilibrium price 2. So portion paid by the buyer, consumer, equals 62 minus 50 equals $8. And then the second part of the rule is portion paid by the vendor equals amount of tax minus amount paid by the buyer. So the amount of the tax is $15. Oh, did I get this wrong? Oh, I got this wrong. My goodness. Sorry, I made a math here. 50 to 62, that's $12. Sorry, $12. Okay, sorry. So the total amount of the tax is $15 per carton, and the buyer pays $12. Therefore, the difference is $3, and that's the amount that the vendor pays. So there's a bit of a trick. There's a bit of a trick to understanding, to figure out which party pays the balance, the greatest part of the tax. Or there's a bit of a trick to understanding how the tax is allocated between the vendor and the buyer in these questions. And the trick concerns the elasticity, the relative elasticity, the relative price elasticity of supply and demand that prevail. So I've come up with some little charts to kind of illustrate this to you, and I'm just going to call them up, and that kind of finishes off this chapter. But this should make it, okay, you kind of just have to understand this stuff. Oh, I see. Okay, so we have our supply and demand curves. And we know that if the slope of a curve is relatively steep, that means this curve is relatively inelastic. It could be the demand curve, it could be the supply curve. And if the curve is relatively flat, then the curve is relatively elastic. So demand curve and supply curve. So the trick to these questions is the party with the relatively more inelastic curves pays the greatest incidence of the tax. This is the conclusion. The party having the relatively more inelastic curve pays the greater incidence of the tax. So when you're doing these kind of questions, if I were you, what I would do is make one of your curves relatively inelastic, so relatively steep, and make the other curve relatively neutral. And when you do that, you can kind of figure this stuff out pretty quickly. So let's say we have the demand curve is relatively more inelastic than the supply curve. So you can see in my little diagram here, I've got the demand curve is quite steep, and the supply curve number one, is relatively, it's neutral. I try to draw it on a 45-degree angle. So here's our tobacco case. We have our original equilibrium price down here. Here's our original equilibrium quantity here. And then the government imposes an excise tax, jerks the price up to here. So the amount paid by the buyer, is the amount between the new equilibrium price and the original equilibrium price. So that's the amount paid by the buyer. And the amount paid by the seller is the total amount of the tax minus buyer amount equals seller amount. So you can see just by eyeballing this diagram that when the demand curve is relatively more inelastic than the supply curve, the buyer ends up paying the greatest incidence of the tax, because here's 90% of the tax here, and here's 10% here. So this 10%, this is simply the vertical distance. The total amount paid is the vertical distance from the original equilibrium price plus the amount of the tax. And so this little bracket refers to that amount there. Okay, so that's one scenario. The demand curve is relatively steep and the supply curve is relatively shallow. And then in the second scenario here, we have the demand curve is relatively more elastic than the supply curve. So I left the supply curve at the same slope as before, and now the demand curve is relatively shallow, so the demand curve is relatively elastic. The government imposes its same tax as in the last scenario. So here's the first equilibrium price. Here's the new equilibrium price, because again, the equilibrium price is set by the intersection of the supply and demand curve. So the buyer amount equals the new equilibrium price minus the old equilibrium price, and the seller amount equals total tax minus buyer amount. So we can see in this example, here's the total amount of the tax here, this amount here, or whatever it is, and the buyer amount is quite small, minus the buyer amount. The amount of the buyer amount is small, well, it's just this little bit here, and so the difference is the seller amount, and we can see from this example that the seller bears the greatest portion of the tax. So when the demand curve is relatively elastic in relation to the supply curve, the supplier picks up the biggest portion of the tax. And then in the next example, I have kind of a neutral demand curve. Oh, frick. Anyways, here's our demand curve. And the supply curve is relatively more inelastic, so the supply curve is relatively steep. Here's our original equilibrium price. Here's our original equilibrium quantity. And the government imposes its same tax. So the buyer amount equals the new equilibrium price minus original equilibrium price, so the buyer pays this little amount here. And the vendor amount equals the total amount minus the buyer amount equals the seller amount. And we can see, again, in this case, the seller bears a relatively high portion of the tax. And then the final scenario is here's our demand curve, here's our demand curve again. Get this thing's mixed up. Oh, I forgot to move these over. Sorry, I was in a bit of a rush. S1, S2. So we have a relatively elastic supply curve. So here's our original equilibrium price here. Supply curve is relatively elastic. Here's our total amount of tax right here. Buyer pays this portion because here's the difference between the buyer equals new equilibrium price. New equilibrium price minus the original equilibrium price, and the vendor amount is total tax minus buyer amount equals seller amount. And so we can see that the seller pays a relatively small amount. So the conclusion from all this is this. The party having the relatively more inelastic curve pays the greatest incidence of tax. So in this example right here, we can see that the demand curve is relatively more inelastic than the supply curve because the slope of the demand curve is steeper than the slope of the supply curve. So the buyer picks up the greatest portion of the tax there. When we go backwards, the supply curve is relatively more inelastic than the demand curve, so the seller picks up the greatest portion there. And the same thing happens on the demand curve side. So when the supply curve is relatively more elastic than the demand curve, the seller picks up the greatest portion. And back to the original scenario, when the demand curve is relatively more inelastic than the supply curve, the buyer picks up the greatest portion. So that's the rule. The party with the relatively more inelastic curve pays the greatest incidence of the tax. Anyways, I think if you can kind of remember that rule, and if you can remember how to draw these diagrams with the correct, properly sloped lines, you can kind of figure it out. Okay, and so that's it for chapter 6. So that's it for the week. Talk to you later.